Hello and welcome back to Parallax Scrolling for web design. Now that we've got our scrolling working magnificently, the only thing we have left to do is to animate our menu items. Now we're not going to animate the menu items themselves, but when we click on the menu items, instead of just jumping to that point in the page, we want to animate to that point in the page. So again, we're going to do that using jQuery. So let's jump back into our files. And we're starting with the files we ended with in the last video, which you can find in the Lesson 13 End folder. And once we save everything here, again, they will be saved in the Lesson 14 End folder. So if we jump into our HTML, I want to point out something about our anchors or our links here in the main nav section. Remember, we gave each of our links a class. We gave this one a class of Earth, a class of Moon, Rocket, and Saturn. At this point, we're going to use these classes in our jQuery to point to the appropriate link. So we want to point to this link to tell it to animate us back to the top of the page. We want to click on this link this link with a class of Moon to tell us to animate to the section of the page where the Moon article is. So we're going to be using these classes. So I just wanted to point out again that those classes are there so that you'll know what we're talking about whenever we point to it in our jQuery. So let's jump into our JavaScript file. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a click function for each of our buttons. So let's skip a couple lines here after. We're still inside this document ready function here, but we're doing this after the window.bind event listener. So still, again, inside that document ready function, we're going to create another event listener to listen for the click event. And this is done using the click method instead of the bind method here. So we're going to, again, point to, this time, our first link. So our first link is an anchor tag. And again, we'll put this inside single quotes, and then we would type in the item that we're looking for as if it were CSS. So we're going to type in a.earth. So we're looking for an anchor tag with a class of Earth. And once we find that, we're going to add the click listener to it. So whenever we click on that particular button or that particular link, we want it to perform the following function. So we'll put function, opening and close parentheses, space, and then we'll put our opening curly bracket, skip a couple lines, and put our closing curly bracket and closing parentheses here, and then a semicolon to end that statement. So inside this function, we're going to cause an animation to occur. We want to animate from wherever we currently are on the page to the top of the page. Since this is the Earth link that we're talking about, we want that one to take us back to the very top of the page. And we're going to use that scroll top JavaScript property here that we've already talked about, that we've used before, to tell us where to go. So we can set that scroll top equal to something. If we set it equal to 0, then that will scroll us back to the very top of the page. So again, inside the click function is where we're going to make that happen. So what we want to do is we want to point to, I'll go ahead and put our $ there and then our parentheses. We're going to point to the HTML and the body selectors. So we'll type HTML, comma, space, body. And then we want that to animate. So there's an animate function, and the animate function here is expecting a few things. The first thing it's expecting are the properties that we want to animate, and then the duration that we want it to take. So the property that we're going to animate is scroll top, the same property we used down here in the parallax function. So inside the parentheses for animate, we would put any of the property value pairs that we want to animate here inside curly brackets. So I'll go ahead and put our opening and closing curly brackets here, and then inside those curly brackets we would put the property value pairs that we want to animate. Well, again, we want to animate the scroll top JavaScript property, and we want to animate it to a value of 0. So we would type :0. And since that's the only property we want to animate here, I'm going to move my cursor over outside of those curly brackets, and we're going to type comma, space, and then the next item that this animate function is expecting. Well, the next thing it's expecting is the duration. How long do we want this animation to take? How long, once we click on that back home button, how long do we want it to take to animate us from where we are to the top of the page? And this number is going to be in milliseconds. So if we want this to last 1 second, we would type 1000 here. Now, ideally, that's all we would need to do. We would go to the end of this line, put a semicolon, and then go to the next line and put one more line of code here, return false. But then we could save our file, jump into our page, refresh our page, and then let's just scroll down and click on the back home button. And it works perfectly. That's exactly what we want. Now, unfortunately, there's a little quirk in iOS, in the iOS operating system, that requires us to have to do one more thing to get this to work properly, and it's very simple to do. What we need to do is we need to add another item inside the animate function, and the animate function is expecting a few things, and then there are some optional things you can add as well. You can add an easing function if you wanted to after the duration here, so we could say comma space, and then we could either choose swing or we could choose linear. But I'm going to leave it at the default, which is swing, which gives it a little bit of easing in and out of the animation. And then another option after the easing is going to be a function that you want to run whenever the animation is finished. And really, we don't want anything to happen after the animation is finished. But for the sake of iOS, we need to basically put another call to this parallax function here, which will basically check for the scroll position and put our stars and our images in the proper position according to whatever that scroll position is. So we need to make sure that we include that here. So what we're going to do is after our 1000 here, we're going to say comma space, and we'll create our function here. So let's actually put this on the next line just to make it a little easier to read. We're going to type in function, and then an opening and closing parenthesis for that function, space, our opening and closing curly bracket, and we'll move that closing curly bracket down a couple of lines. And then inside that function, we're just going to put another function call to the parallax function that we created. And everything will still work the same. Let's save that and refresh our page. We'll scroll down and then click on the back home button, and it still animates just fine. But doing that helps us with iOS devices in order to get everything to continue working properly there. So we've created this entire function here, and that's just for the Earth link, for this back home link at the top. We still need to do the same thing for the moon link, the space flight link, and the see the planets link. And we're going to do something slightly different here because we don't know what that position is supposed to be. So we can't set it to a number. Instead, we're going to point to the named anchor. So let's go ahead and just copy this entire click function here. Command C to copy it, Control C if you're using a PC, skip a couple lines and paste it. Okay, so instead of pointing to a.earth here, we need to point to a.moon, which is the class name we gave to that particular link or that anchor tag. And most of this is still going to look the same, but the difference is right here. Instead of setting scroll top to 0, we're going to set it equal to that named anchor. So we're going to delete that 0 there, and we're going to point to that named anchor using jQuery syntax. So we'll put our opening $sign that you should be familiar with, and then inside parentheses and inside single quotes, we'll put £moon. Now this still isn't going to work because scroll top is looking for a number, and £moon is not a number. What we're going to do is we're going to point to this named anchor and then find out how far that named anchor is from the top of the page. And the way we do that is we type dot offset, open and close parentheses, dot top. So in other words, how far is this moon anchor offset from the top of the page or the top of the browser window? So now let's save that, test our file, Command R to refresh or Control R on a PC. And now we'll click on the moon link and it animates just perfectly for us. So we can click back home and we can go back and forth between these two buttons as much as we want. Now the other two still don't work. They're just solid links, but we'll make that work now simply by copying and pasting. So we'll grab this function here. Let's get rid of some of this white space in here so that we can see that this is all one function. We'll do the same thing for our Earth click function. There we go. So we're going to take the click function here for the moon, copy it, skip a couple lines, paste it, And the second section is the rocket section. So we'll type a.rocket, and we're pointing to the named anchor of pound rocket. And then after that click function, we'll skip a couple lines and paste it one more time. This time, instead of moon or rocket, we're pointing to the link with a class of Saturn, and we're going to scroll to the named anchor pound Saturn. So we'll save that, jump back into our file, refresh our page, click on the back home link to take us to the very top, and then we can cycle through each of our buttons, and hopefully each one will work just fine. And they do. So we can go back and forth from one button to the next. We can go from the very top to the very bottom and just play around with this a little bit. Click on all the different buttons in different orders just to make sure that everything continues to work all right and everything looks great. So now we're finished with our final parallax scrolling project. So I hope you've learned a lot from this. We've now created 3 levels of scrolling here with a surprisingly small amount of jQuery in order to make it work. So that wraps it up. In the next video, we'll have some final thoughts and then send you on your way to start creating some amazing projects of your own. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.